Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Master Series. For those of you who are joining us in the Master Series for the very first time, this is a little bit different than my Zero to Hero series. In the Master Series, we look at more advanced and unknown topics and features within FiveM, and today what we're going to be talking about is routing buckets. Routing buckets are a really exciting feature that's available in FiveM through OneSync. So let's talk a little bit about what routing buckets are. Routing buckets, you can think of them, some people call them instancing or other worlds. Essentially, you can have multiple players on the same server that are existing in different instances of that world. So you can have player A that cannot see or interact or anything with player B. And in each of these routing buckets or instances, you do, as long as it's enabled, you have access, your NPCs spawn, your vehicles spawn, and everything else, but they are all unique to that world. So it's like having a bunch of servers in one. And what's great is you can freely move players between routing buckets as frequently as you want. Same thing with entities. You can move vehicles, props between routing buckets. And you also have a little bit of control over the security and some other features within the routing buckets that we'll be talking about. So what are routing buckets actually useful for? There's a lot of great use cases for routing buckets. I think the most common use case for routing buckets that you're going to see is character creation screens. So when a person connects to the server, you throw them into a routing bucket with just themselves while they're in the character selection screen. That way, if you have a physical place where people select and create their characters, you obviously don't want players stacked on top of each other. So each one gets their own routing bucket. Routing buckets are way more simple to use than trying to make them invisible or make other people invisible. It's much more clean and straightforward. Another example might be on PvP servers. You want to have different lobbies. Let's say you have like a 2v2 PvP mode. Obviously, if you have 60 players connected, you don't want them interfering with each other. So when a match starts, you have a separate routing bucket just for that match. And another great example is missions. If you have missions in your server that you maybe don't want players that are uninvolved in the mission interfering with, you can stick all of the players and vehicles and everything else related to that mission in their own routing bucket. They can complete the mission and then be moved back into the main routing bucket with all the other players. There are, of course, a ton of other ways to use routing buckets, but those are probably some of the most popular ones. Now, before we dive in and start looking at how to use routing buckets, let's talk about a couple important callouts with routing buckets. First, when you're looking into routing buckets online, you might see some outdated mentions of people saying that they're limited to 64 buckets. That is no longer the case. You can have an unlimited number of buckets. There's not an upper bound that you have to worry about anymore. One thing that I very intentionally didn't mention when I talked about routing bucket use cases is interiors. Your first idea with a routing bucket might be, oh, perfect, I can use the same apartment interior for all of my players and I'll just routing bucket based on who's in whose apartment. That's a bad idea and you shouldn't do it, because then those players that are in the apartment won't be able to see anybody outside of the apartment, right? If another human player is driving by on the street down below, they're not going to be able to see that. So use Rockstar's conceal natives when you're talking about interiors that you can see outside of, like the GTA Online apartments. And finally, just a quick call out. When we manipulate routing buckets, all of that is done via the server side. There are no client-side natives for routing buckets. You can't have a client script that changes a player's routing bucket or something like that. All of our routing bucket manipulation is going to be done server side. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the code and start playing with routing buckets. So the first native we're going to talk about is GetPlayerRoutingBucket, which, pretty sanely named native, is going to tell you the routing bucket that the player is in. So let's go ahead and build that, and I'm just going to register a command here, which is how we're going to be doing most of this today. We're not building an end product here. We're just looking at the natives available and how they behave. So I'm going to register a command, and I'm just going to call it GetPlayerRoutingBucket. And remember, like I said, we're only working on the server here. So this is a server-side script. All of the code we're writing today is on the server. All right, so I'm going to say target ID is equal to the first argument or the source. So we can pass in the ID of another player to get their routing bucket. And then we're just going to say routing bucket, if I can type tonight, is equal to GetPlayerRoutingBucket. This is our native, and we'll pass in the target ID. All right, and now let's send that back to the user. I have a helper function here that I'm going to be using today called sendMessage. All it does is trigger a chat add message event on the source that I pass in, just to reduce a little bit of boilerplate. So I'm going to say send message to the person that requested it and say player routing bucket is that, and do target ID and routing bucket. If you're not familiar with this format notation that I'm using here, this is just a way to kind of templify a string. So I have a string here. Each of these S's will be replaced by the parameters down here. All right, so let's start our routing script and let's see what we've got. Now, I do have two clients running today. Bottom right is going to be clients with server ID 2, and top left is going to be the client with server ID 1. So let's just go ahead and get player routing bucket for ourselves. And as you'll see, the default bucket, if you're not using routing buckets on your server, and even when you are, when a client first joins the server, the default routing bucket is always 0. So in this case, we can see player 1 is in routing bucket 0. And if I did the same thing for player 2 is also in routing bucket 0. All right, along the same lines as getting player routing buckets, we can also get the routing bucket for an entity like a vehicle or prop, something like that. The native is probably what you expect, GetEntityRoutingBucket, and the parameter is an entity ID. So let's go ahead and implement this. I'm going to register another command called GetEntityRoutingBucket. And it's important to note that we're going to need the entity ID to do this. And remember, the entity IDs in the client and the server are not the same. So the client is going to send the network ID of the entity up. The server will convert it into an entity ID and then get the routing bucket. So we're going to say entity ID is equal to network get entity from network ID, and then toNumber args1. This network get entity from network ID requires an integer. And then our routing bucket is going to be GetEntityRoutingBucket, and we'll give it the entity ID. And now we can just send a message back to the user, entity with net ID, routing bucket is that. Wonderful, let's take a look. So you probably noticed I have an ItaliGTO sitting in front of us, and that's for a good reason. It's to test entity stuff with. I also have a small utility script running in the background that allows me to get the entity and network IDs of anything that I'm looking at. So I'm going to use that to get the network ID of this car. I'm going to say rcinfo is my command. So I can see that the network ID of the car is 34, and if we call GetEntityRoutingBucket and give it network ID 34, now because it's in the same routing bucket as us and we already know our routing bucket is 0, we can guess pretty well that this is probably going to be 0 as well. And sure enough, the entity with network ID 34's routing bucket is 0. So now that we know how to get the routing bucket that a player is in, let's talk about how to change a player's routing bucket. And the native for this, pretty simple, SetPlayerRoutingBucket. And the first parameter is going to be the player source, player ID, and the second parameter is going to be the routing bucket that we want to stick them in. So let's dive into the code and implement this. We're going to register a command and say SetPlayerRoutingBucket. And we're going to say the target ID, same thing we did before, is that. And then the routing bucket is going to be the second argument. And then we will call SetPlayerRoutingBucket with our target ID and our routing bucket. And just send a message to the user to confirm what happened. Wonderful. So that's going to be it for our set command. Let's go ahead and restart our resource and take a look at how this works. So I'm going to, I know top left is player 1, so I'm going to set player 2 to another routing bucket. So if I go set player routing bucket and client 2, and then we're just going to put them in routing bucket 5. And as soon as I hit enter, if we watch the bottom right screen, we get a script error. I see. This needs to be capitalized, SetPlayerRoutingBucket. All right, let's try this again. We're looking at him, and he's down here. And we're going to call SetPlayerRoutingBucket with client 2 and routing bucket 5. And now you'll see he disappeared in the top left, and on the top right, he's now in his own routing bucket. We're not there, our car's not there, and you'll also notice the cars that he sees are totally different from the cars that we see. That's what I talked about, how each routing bucket has its own entity spawning and things like that. So if we move ourselves to routing bucket 5, you'll see he shows back up, but our car is not there because it's still back in routing bucket 0. So let's move both of us back to 0. I'll come back, my car's back, and set player routing bucket 2 and 0. All right, we're all back to where we were before. So let's talk about moving entities between routing buckets. It's exactly the same as how we moved a player from a routing bucket, except we're obviously going to pass the entity ID instead of the player ID, and the native is SetEntityRoutingBucket. Exact same parameters there though. So let's go ahead and implement that. We'll register my command, SetEntityRoutingBucket, and we're going to say the target ID is network, get entity from network ID, the first argument, and then the routing bucket is going to be the second argument, and then we're going to say SetEntityRoutingBucket, and let's call this entity ID instead of target ID. Entity ID and routing bucket, and then let's just confirm it to the user. We're all set. We'll go ahead and restart the resource and see how this works. So both client 1 and 2 are still chilling in routing bucket 0. And let's move the car, which if we remember from before, the network ID is 34. It's not going to be changed. So let's say SetEntityRoutingBucket 34, and let's change it to 3. We've clearly got a small issue here, entity 0, so something has gone wrong here. Network get entity from network, once again, to number. All right, second time's the charm. So we'll set entity routing bucket 34.3, and poof, our car is gone. Now, if we go ahead and jump over to routing bucket 3 with set player routing bucket, actually, here's a good example of something we can do in the meantime. Let's say get entity routing bucket 34 and just observe that it is indeed in routing bucket 3. Okay, now let's set ourselves to that routing bucket. And we will be there with the car, but obviously the second client won't. And we're there with the car, second client still all by himself. All right, we're doing really, really well. We know how to determine what routing bucket players and entities are in, and we now know how to move players and entities between routing buckets. Let's talk about 2 extra natives with some nice features that are available with routing buckets. The first native we're going to be looking at is SetRoutingBucketPopulationEnabled. And this essentially controls if population is enabled in a specific routing bucket. So we can have some routing buckets where population, that's NPCs driving cars, things like that, are enabled and naturally spawning. And then we can have other routing buckets where they aren't. So once again, maybe in a mission, you want to tightly control the environment. You don't want NPCs in that mission environment, or in a PvP environment, or any other use case for routing buckets. We can selectively enable and disable the population on any routing bucket that we want. The first parameter is going to be the routing bucket, and then the second parameter is true for population enabled and false for population disabled. Let's go ahead and test it out. So once again, we're going to start with registering command SetRoutingBucketPopulationEnabled. And then we're going to want routing bucket is equal to the first argument, and then we'll say enabled is equal to argument 2 equaling true. So that way we can use true false. And then of course we will just say set routing bucket population enabled, pass in our routing bucket and our enabled flag, and then send some feedback to the user. Wonderful. With that implemented, let's see what happens. So we have both of our clients and our vehicle in routing bucket 3. That's where we're going to test this at. And if we call SetRoutingBucketPopulationEnabled, we're in 3 and set it to false. Now, because we're in the routing bucket that we're disabling population in, the population that's already around us will only go away when the game engine decides to clean it up, but any new spawns won't occur. And if you look down the street here on client number 1 in the top left, you'll start to see some distant entities disappear as soon as we disable this. And then as we watch, you'll see that no new population is spawning. So if we hit it, You can already start to see vehicles kind of disappear as the game engine decides to clean them up. And you'll see that no other vehicles are spawning. So of course, maybe if you didn't want there to be vehicles at all, you should probably disable population in that routing bucket before the player gets to it. We can try that. Let's do routing bucket 9. And so we'll disable population there, and then I'll move myself there. And you can see we have no population. And if we were to enable it in 9, you would immediately start to see NPCs, vehicles, everything appearing once again. All right, we only have one more native to cover. This one's a little bit more security focused, and it's going to be SetRoutingBucketEntityLockdownMode. And this can control lockdown mode for specific routing buckets instead of the server overall. So if you're not familiar with lockdown mode, it essentially controls if clients can spawn entities, props, vehicles, things of that nature. And there's 3 modes. Strict disables everything. This is somewhat similar to disabling population, but what it also does is it disables, you can't spawn, a client cannot spawn a car or anything like that. In relaxed mode, the game engine will still spawn population and things of that nature. The game engine can still spawn the entities that it thinks needs to exist. However, scripts cannot spawn entities. So if we have a script that spawns a car, it would not work. And then finally, we have inactive, which is the default mode, and that's a free-for-all. So if you're building a server from the ground up and you're not using a bunch of existing resources which are poorly designed, you can spawn all of your entities on the server using OneSync, vehicles, props, everything like that. And then you can have lockdown mode enabled, which prevents any client-side mods or hacks, things like that, from being able to spawn entities. It just doesn't work. So this is a great security measure, and we can apply it on a routing bucket, on a per routing bucket basis for whatever reason we might want to. So let's go ahead and try it out. I will register my command, SetRoutingBucketEntityLockdownMode. And then we will say routing bucket is equal to the first argument, and mode is going to be equal to the second argument. And we'll say set routing bucket entity lockdown mode, routing bucket, and mode. And then give some feedback to the user and try it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move all of us back into routing bucket 1, or correction, routing bucket 0. It looks like I might have had population disabled here, so I'm going to enable population again. And of course, in inactive mode, everything's like you're probably used to. So if we use the car command from a couple episodes ago in my Zero to Hero series, spawn a Panto, it shows up perfectly fine. Now, if we move this to relaxed, set routing bucket entity lockdown mode, and we're in 0 and we're going to set it to relaxed. You'll notice our population still spawns. We've got cars spawning and showing up everywhere. But if I try to spawn a car, since my car script is client side, no car gets to exist. It pops up for a fraction of a second until the game engine realizes what's happening, and then it's gone. So hackers aren't going to be able to spawn in their own vehicles or massive disruptive props or things like that. And now if we move to strict mode, then nothing will be able to spawn. So in this mode, you'll notice that slowly but surely, all of the cars will start to disappear as the game engine gets rid of them, and no new ones will show up. And if we try to spawn a car, no love. And then if we move back to inactive, we can spawn a car perfectly fine. So those are the 6 natives you must know for using routing buckets. I hope you learned something today. Maybe you didn't know about routing buckets at all, and now you have some great new ideas, or maybe you didn't know how they worked or how effective they were. Now you know they're a fantastic resource, and I highly encourage you to use them for some of the scenarios I described or the scenarios that you can think of. If you have a great idea for how you're going to be using routing buckets, please do drop it in the comments down below. The comment engagement truly helps the channel grow, and it's great to talk with all of you. Along the same lines, don't forget to join my Discord if you're not already. The link is down in the description. Got a great group of developers there, very helpful. I'm always there and active and trying to help out where I can, so definitely a great place to be. Other than that, be sure to hit subscribe and the bell icon if you enjoyed the video and want to get more content from me. Hit like, and we will see you in the next one.